This week's Torah portion has a lot of discussion on sacrifices, but I want to focus actually on one mitzvah in this week's Torah portion that finds a very odd placement. I mean, it's obviously a very noble mitzvah, but it's like crammed in between the discussion of sacrifices. It is the mitzvah of Peah, Leket. The Torah tells us in this week's Torah portion that when one was reaping the harvest of their land, you should not completely remove the corner of your field. You know what do they call side locks? Peyot is like the corner. So there was a peyah, there was a corner of your field. Now, biblically, there is no measure for how much of a corner you're supposed to leave over from your field. Rabbinically, there's a suggestion that you should leave over 1/60th of the corner of your field. Why should you leave over a corner of your field? That should be left for the poor. Meaning after you reap the harvest of your field, the poor know that they can come and there's a little corner in each man's field, in each lady's field, that is left for them. There's also another mitzvah that says that when you're gathering your harvest and one or two sheaves fall, don't bother to pick them up. You should also leave that for the poor. And Ani Hashem Elokeichem, I'm the Lord your God. I know that you're actually doing it. I will reward you, and so on and so forth. Now, Maimonides, when explaining this particular commandment, gives it in great detail. He says you shouldn't gather the stalks that fall. You shouldn't. You have to leave over, like I mentioned. Do not completely remove the grain in the corners of your field, and so on and so forth. Now, but again, let's go back to our original question. Why is this somewhat unrelated mitzvah doing sandwich between the description of the sacrifices that occurred in the temple? That's really the question from today. Now, Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, does address this. And he writes that Rav Avdimi taught in the name of Rabbi Yosef that the reason that the Torah placed the commandments of Leket, the collection, Shicha, if you forgot to collect a minimum amount, Peah, the corner of the field. Why did they place them in the middle of the discussion of the temple services? And this is the line that Rashi says, to teach that fulfilling these mitzvot properly is equivalent to building the temple and offering sacrifices. Yeah. So if you were binding sheaves of wheat into bundles and you forgot one bundle, don't go back to pick it up. If certain stalks fall, leave them for the poor. Your corner of your field, leave. These three mitzvahs are equivalent to the building of the temple and its offering of sacrifices. Okay. Now we have Rashi. He explains why this mitzvah is sandwiched between the laws of the sacrifices. But really, it's just telling us a fact. Where does this notion come from that these acts of kindness are really equivalent to the sacrifices? Now, if I ask you, could you tell me one mitzvah that you've grown to learn is a substitute for sacrifices? What mitzvah would you say that is? It's prayer. You've all learned that. Tefillah b'makom karbanis tiknum. Prayer was instituted in lieu of sacrifices. Why? Why is prayer in lieu of sacrifices? The simple notion is that what happens when you offer a sacrifice? What is supposed to happen when you offer a sacrifice? So the Rambam writes, actually not the Rambam, the Ramban writes, Nachmanides writes, what was the main thrust of offering sacrifices? What was the purpose of offering sacrifices? The process of offering an animal as an atonement was meant to invoke a serious imagery that what's happening to the animal could or should be happening to me. In the words of the Ramban Nachmanides, his approach is very novel. He says, human function is executed by the vehicles of what? Speech, thought, and action. Everything that goes into bringing a sacrifice is meant to stimulate those senses. We're meant to put our hands on the animal, mirroring the evil action that led you to bring this sacrifice to begin with. We are meant to verbally confess our sin, mirroring anything that may have been done incorrectly with our speech. The animal is burnt, depending which sacrifice, depends what part of the animal is burnt. Those are supposed to mirror the limbs and the parts of your body that were overtaken by this lustful fire to do what you did, even though God doesn't want you to do it. And so on and so forth. The legs represent us walking towards the sin. The animal's blood is analogous to the blood in our own bodies. All of these acts are performed, the Ramban says, so that the person should realize that they sinned against God with body and soul. And instead, what did God do? God took a ransom. He took a substitute. Instead of you, God took this offering. Now, the Ramban basically is saying that we bring a sacrifice because through the sacrifice, we're supposed to have a deep, meditative, introspective experience that connects us to God to recreate a relationship that may have been affected and negatively impacted by our sin. Now that you understand that, you understand that prayer is really a good substitute for sacrifice. Because what is prayer? Prayer is all about creating a connection to God. Prayer is about having a conversation with God. What happens when two people fight, God forbid, or when two people fall out with each other? You got to communicate. You got to talk it out. Got to talk about what led you there, what happened, what was going through your mind. Why do you think it won't happen again? Reconnecting, recommitting to the relationship. So it's understandable that prayer seems to be the perfect substitute. Why is charity the perfect substitute for prayer? Why is charity, as the Medrash says, just like building the temple and offering its sacrifices? What element does charity have when we already put forward how perfect really prayer makes sense to be in lieu of sacrifices? So the Alter Rebbe writes, and by the way, if you learn nothing else but this, it's beautiful. Why is the mitzvah of tzedakah, why is the mitzvah of charity held in such high regard in the Torah? Tzedakah tatzom mimavos, charity saves from death. We want God to show kindness and benevolence upon our children, or God forbid in illness. Why is charity? What does charity have on anything else? So the Alter Rebbe writes that you are correct, that charity is given disproportionate importance in all of Jewish literature. The Talmud says that charity is equivalent to all other mitzvahs. So the Alter Rebbe says, why is this so? Because, and in fact, we find that every mitzvah can be termed tzedakah. Why? Because just like tzedakah is considered to be the most important practical mitzvah, every time you do a mitzvah, you can call it tzedakah. So the Alter Rebbe writes, the purpose of every mitzvah is to transform the person and carry over his or her life to God. There isn't a mitzvah, the Alter Rebbe writes, in which a person's life and energy is more invested than the mitzvah of tzedakah. Why? Can't I invest in building my sukkah? Can't I? Why? Why does tzedakah have more invested of me than any other mitzvah? So the Alter Rebbe says, think about it. With any other mitzvah, only one single part of the person is invested in the action. By contrast, when you give money away, your entire being is invested. Why? When you go ahead and you give away money for tzedakah, you could use that money for yourself. You could buy things for yourself. So, in fact, when you earned the money for yourself, your entire being was invested in it. And now, even though you could use what you invested your entire energy into creating money to buy things for your own personal use, when you give it away, you're giving away, in fact, your entire life. You're giving all the energy invested in making that money. And that's why it says that tzedakah hastens the redemption. Why? For one donation supplements so much of the donor's energy in life, something that's not possible even after many mitzvahs. So in a way, charity involves one's entire physical being. They represent and embody one's lifeblood in a sacrificial act. In that way, since you sacrifice everything you could do for your own personal gain with the money that you're giving away, that's why it becomes an appropriate substitute for the idea of sacrifices in general, because giving tzedakah is a sacrifice on your part. You're giving of oneself. And the Rebbe echoes this thought and says that the comparison of gifts to the poor to offering sacrifices is obvious. When a person offers a sacrifice, they give something of themselves to God. And the same thing occurs when donating gifts to the poor. The donor gives away their possessions to another person by God's command. Understanding that tzedakah is a form of sacrifice, it leads us to understand something very unique in the world of sacrifices in general. Because there was one offering in the temple that stood apart from all other offerings in the temple. It was called the Korban Ha'etzim, the sacrifice of the wood. Maimonides tells us that there were certain families that had a fixed time when they would go out to the forest. It was their family month or week to pile up on wood and offer that wood for the altar. On the day designated for this family to bring their wood sacrifice, by the way, they didn't sacrifice the wood, but the wood sacrifice means that they would bring this donation of wood to be used on the altar. It was celebrated as a tremendous festival. The family was forbidden to mourn, and so on and so forth. We don't find such a joyous occasion in the bringing of any other offerings to the temple like the offering of the wood donation. Now the question is, why was this wood donation given such a special status, given like this superior offering compared to any other offering? And the answer is, based upon what we talked about sacrifice, that if from all the sacrifices, the one that had the least possibility of getting our egos involved was the sacrifice of the wood offering. You see, our egos can get in the way of pretty much anything. In fact, the mere idea that we can give a gift to God is a perfect scenario to get our egos going. Tzedakah, charity, gives anyone the possibility for some ego massaging. I did somebody a favor, I did someone good, I donated a building, my name, and so on and so forth. Nothing wrong with any of that. But even tzedakah, something as selfless as tzedakah, does run the danger of us becoming a little bit egocentric. In fact, a person, a former sinner, can actually, by offering enough offerings, can quickly turn into some level of self-adulation. What is the one sacrifice that really, there's very little about it that could possibly ever make you feel like you should be on top of the world? It was the sacrifice or the offering of the wood. You see, because the wood itself that was donated to the temple was not an actual offering. You didn't go to the temple with the Kohen and said, okay, here's my offering. I can feel good. The Kohen's with me. I'm bringing something to God. It's pleasant to God. Your wood was just a medium by which sacrifices could be offered in the temple. You brought your wood. They said thank you, and you went home. The actual sacrifices that burnt on the wood were not your sacrifices. You couldn't take credit for it. So that's why this donation was given with such joy. That's why the day that each family that had their privilege to donate the wood made this day into a holiday. Why? Because it was a donation that was unsplashy. It was an offering that had the least acclaim in the temple. And there was no way that these families were going to think of themselves as being important donors. They were just basically ordinary people helping out the situation. The altar needs wood in order to, okay, tell me when it's my family's turn. We'll go out, we'll gather dry wood, and we'll bring it to you, and that's it. It was an egoless giving. It was the most special and greatest level of service because it was entirely for the sake of heaven, l'shem shamayim. That's why that offering was so special. You know, on a side note, I am a Chabad rabbi. Chabad rabbis grow up supposedly learning Chassidut, and the third Lubavitcher Rebbe said in the name of the Alter Rebbe, the founder of the Chabad movement, when asked, what is the purpose of the study of Chassidut? Baal Shem Tov introduced this idea, this doctrine of revealing the teachings of Jewish mysticism in the form of Chassidut. I mean, Jewish life existed before. What is the purpose of Chassidut? And the answer is, in short, Chassidut was meant to change a person's character. And the first order of the day, as Hasidim would say, is that you have to have the I, the ego, in check. That's the whole purpose of Chassidut, that it's not about you, it's about God. It's about another Jew. It's about God's purpose of the world. And that's why maybe we can say that the offering of the wood was the foundation for all other sacrifices. Why? Because without the wood, you can't offer a sacrifice. But maybe a little bit deeper, the offering of the wood was not only the practical necessity of having wood to offer a sacrifice, it was truly the foundation, because all other sacrifices was meant to follow suit from the offering of the wood. Just like the offering of the wood could not be somehow donated with fanfare and made you believe that you were so important. All the other sacrifices, which is some form of tzedakah, of charity, is also meant to be given in a way where it's egoless. Charity is meant to be given where it's egoless. You know the famous story of the Rothschild. They say it about Rothschild. The Rothschild was once asked, what is your wealth? And he gave a number. And they questioned him, it's well known that you're far wealthier than that. He said, I only gave you the number of the monies that I gave away. That's the money that I own. The money that I help people with, that's what I can claim as my own. Because that mitzvah will never be taken away from me. All the other money that you think I have, one day you have it, one day you don't have it. That story shares with us a sense of egolessness that he had. He didn't take credit. He gave tzedakah because he thought he was in a position to give it. And that Hashem ultimately, really, really at the end of the day, sets up the world in a way that we have the haves and we have the have-nots, which we'll talk about in a moment. So why was kindness in particular chosen as a substitute for sacrifices, as opposed to prayer, which we said seems more like the natural replacement, is because really it's meant to be given in an egoless way. This also explains something very interesting, that if I asked, what is the greatest form of kindness? What is the greatest form of charity? We know that Maimonides describes 8 forms of charity, but there's a form of charity that many of you probably have heard the words, gemilut chasadim, gemilus chesed. What would fall under the category of gemilut chasadim? Hiring somebody who's in need of money for a job, giving them a loan to start a business, giving them maybe a little bridge loan, things of that nature. Now, why is this the highest form of charity? Well, you say because, you know, what's the old Chinese proverb? Better than giving somebody a fish, teach them how to fish. You know, you're putting them on their feet. You're enabling them to support themselves. I know that's true. That's true. That's true. But there's more than that, actually. There's much more than that at the core. You see, the purpose of tzedakah is not only to help the poor person. The purpose of tzedakah is to help the giver as well. If we can appreciate that, we can appreciate why the highest level of tzedakah is when we help somebody, not giving a straight out donation. You see, coming back to the has and the have-nots, King David in his wisdom asked God, why don't you lever, this could be a political statement. We could say King David was the first Democrat. King David said, the Medrash tells us, King David said, God, why don't you level the rich and the poor? In the words of the Medrash, Tiyasher elamcha b'shava. Make your world equal. Ha'ashirim v'aniyim. The poor and the wealthy. You should level the playing field. So what does God say? If I were to do that, how would people ever know goodness and kindness? If all are equally poor or rich, who would be able to do kindness? So what does God do? God says, listen, I created the world, and I created the world with my infinite wisdom. In my infinite wisdom, I wanted a world to have the haves and the have-nots. Why? Because this way I create a possibility for kindness. Why is it important for human beings to do kindness? Because I wanted a world where human beings could emulate me. And just like God does acts of kindness, if people will do acts of kindness and behave like me, I'm not only did I create human beings, I created human beings that become more godly. But the human being, while he can do great acts of kindness, which, by the way, the bottom line is always the act of kindness. Somebody would tell me, Rabbi, if I give you a large donation, it's going to really do terrible things to my ego. I'll say, don't worry, I'll give you a good therapist and you'll figure it out. So the bottom line is, it's the donation that counts. But the truth is, we can give charity. We're looking for the ultimate, right? A person could give charity, and he could be giving it entirely for self-centered reasons. All of a sudden, enter Gemilut Chasadim. When the Torah wants to describe what is the highest form of charity, it tells us, provide means of livelihood where, number one, the taker can retain all levels of respect, can retain all levels of pride, humanhood. And that's very important. But that's about the taker. What about the giver? If tzedakah is all about the giver, if Hashem says, I created the world in order to have people give so they could become more godly. But if you're going to give charity and you're going to become self-centered, what's godly about that? So the Torah tells us that's right. When you give tzedakah, it should not be about you. Even though sometimes that's hard with certain forms of tzedakah, but I will tell you, there is a form of tzedakah that's exactly what the point is, and that's supposed to filter down to any type of tzedakah. That's the type of tzedakah, of charity, that you give when you give a loan, when you give work, and so on and so forth. Why? How are you going to stroke your ego? What you do for the guy? You gave him a job. In the meantime, the guy is performing labor. You'd have to pay someone else, so you're paying him. No. You gave the guy a loan. You'll be paid back the loan. You couldn't use the money, I understand. But you gave him money, he's going to give you back money. Yes, you could have used the money to earn more money. Okay, how much of an ego can you stroke there? So Gemilas Chesed is the highest form of tzedakah because not only does it do much for the taker, where the taker doesn't have to feel like a schnorrer, it does a lot for the giver, because the giver can't feel much pride either. Gave the guy $1,000. God be willing, he's getting the $1,000 back. So it's such a high form of tzedakah from the giver's side, because it enables the giver to offer the money without ego. And that's exactly the connection between these three types of tzedakah, leket, shichacha, and peah, that's very much connected to this idea of self-sacrifice. You see, when you don't bother to pick up the 2 bundles that fell, I'm sorry, the stocks that fell, or you remembered after the fact that, oh, I forgot that bundle. Should I go back to get it? And the Torah says, don't go back to get it, just leave it in the field. Or when you left a little corner, you go back home. You don't even know who's in need. You don't even know who's going to come get it. You have no gain from it. You can barely stroke your ego, because you actually, in these particular mitzvahs, you can't even choose who should come. You can't even invite people. By the way, you know, I'm harvesting my field. There'll be a corner left tomorrow morning. Yeah, I like you. Come. You know, you're not even supposed to choose who the donation will go to. You don't even know who's going to come. They happen automatically. As soon as 2 stalks of grain fall to the ground, or you forgot a bundle, it's something that's okay. I'm not going back. It's somebody's going to come and get it. Then I don't even know who it's going to be. So if no one needs to ask you, if there's no one to give you a thank you, what's this going to do for your ego? You're just doing what's right. And this is the reason we can now understand the precision of Rashi's language. You know what's interesting? That Rashi says not only are these 3 mitzvahs placed in the middle of the sacrifices, because they are the language of Rashi was, they are equivalent to the building of the temple and the offering of the sacrifices. So we have been answering the whole time where they're akin to the offering of the sacrifices, because the offering of the sacrifice is all about that, a sacrifice, connecting to God, not to let your ego get in the way. And that's what tzedakah is about, but it's also akin to the building of the temple. Why? Because the building of the temple, again, just like the offering of the wood as a donation, was only a medium by which to be able to have the service of the temple. All those that were busy building the temple, there was no fanfare for them. There was no great gratitude for them. It was only to get the job done so that people could have a place to serve Hashem. So these tzedakahs are akin to the building of the temple and the sacrifices, because constructing the temple is hard work, in the words of the Rebbe, and the benefit is that had by all Jews, as opposed to somebody who's offering a personal sacrifice. You did your job and everybody's benefiting from it without a personal thank you to you. It's selfless. So these 3 mitzvahs are placed in this parsha because they're not glorious, grand mitzvahs. There's not much that you could take credit for. They're being done because it's the right thing. And basically, you're not going to walk away saying, wow, what a great guy I am. What a great woman I am. Which is really what sacrifices are supposed to be about and what all tzedakah giving is supposed to be about. Now, I must tell you that living a life where it's less about you, I don't know if there's been a generation that has ever had such a challenging time. Because there's nothing in this world that people barely don't record on social media. I remember somebody sent me a cute thing. It said that somebody was on a mountaintop. It's obviously a fake, and presents his girlfriend with a ring, and figured he waited until they hiked. Scenery was perfect. Bends down on his knee, opens up a box, and offers her a ring. Would you marry me? She says, oh. Then she says, hold on a second. We didn't even record this. Get out your phone and do it again. He takes out the phone. Okay, that's it. She says, let me see. She says, I look terrible. Let's do it again. Take number 72 with her foot up. Nothing's become natural, automatic. Everything's about how we're going to look, how we're going to be seen. So this parsha takes us back to the mitzvah of tzedakah, the mitzvah of davening, the mitzvah of sacrifices. Things are supposed to be a little bit less about ourselves and for the sake of doing the right thing. And that's why the mitzvah of tzedakah is such a mitzvah that's equivalent to all other mitzvahs in the Torah. Because it's one of those mitzvahs that, independent how much ego you have, deep down, deeply rooted, it's a mitzvah that that has all the ingredients that make selflessness so easy.